How y'all doing today? As we say in the South, which is where I'm from, and where jazz is from. Jazz is widely considered to have developed in New Orleans through a bunch of influences that came together. The brass bands that were popular at the time, ragtime music, the work songs that were carried by African folk who were enslaved and forcibly brought to America. They developed blues as a form of a work song, which became an integral part of jazz. The swing rhythm became a foundational piece of jazz, at least for many decades. And I don't know if I've ever seen a good description of why that came to be, but the swing rhythm is similar to the I am in poetry, I think, that I shall always see. And you hear it in Celtic and other music, like, for example, so like that. And in jazz, see, if we don't have that swing in at least what I'd call foundational or classic or traditional jazz, it doesn't sound quite right. So like classic tune In the Mood without a swing sounds like this. Instead of the long, short, long, short, long, short. Right, that sounds like jazz. The history of jazz is a really massive subject, and there are whole college courses on that, even for just decades of jazz. So this is really like a little sampler of some elements of jazz that are, to me, significant and that I like, and that especially are significant from the vantage point of piano, which is my instrument of choice. And was certainly has always been a crucial instrument for jazz, and maybe the primary instrument in some early jazz. So when jazz is seen as having musically evolved out of, again, ragtime work songs, some European harmonies that composers like Debussy were already using, that have we would say today a jazz sound, but they didn't have that terminology at the end of the 19th century. So everybody's heard Maple Leaf Rag as an example of ragtime. So like that, right? That's not quite a swing rhythm, but it was called ragged or syncopated because it had a lot of emphasis on the off or in between beats, which gave the music a little push. And that push proved to be really energizing for dancers, too. A lot of dances evolved out of ragtime and early jazz. And that was part of what made 1920s the jazz era. Jazz was an integral part of culture for a lot of folks, and it started in African American communities, but quickly spread to all communities. And I think jazz has been a big force for integration in this country over the decades. So, like with ragtime, you don't hear like. Offbeat things that give it a little push, which are a crucial part of what makes jazz work and just makes you want to tap your feet. So I'm going to play an early popular jazz song, jazz hit that everybody knows. You'll know this. I am. Um, it's one element that was present in jazz from two elements, or improvising and a sense of playfulness and experimenting and creativity. Um, and that continues to this day, even though songs like that have been done, thousands of times. People that play this kind of music are always looking for some little bit of something new or fun or playful to bring to it. So in the 20s, jazz swing music became what you heard on the radio, that more and more, and what people danced to, and you started to have artists who were very famous. And Louis Armstrong is probably the single biggest name in the history of jazz, and he went on actually and became an ambassador for jazz for the United States, because jazz eventually became a global music. Another big name in piano of those times was Fats Waller. And he had a very outsized personality. You can find some very amusing videos of Fats Waller from back in the day. I didn't even know they made them, but when I was looking up some music of his, it was they were sort of almost like early MTV, tongue-in-cheek sort of things. He was a very colorful character, and he wrote some of the most known jazz hits of probably the last 100 years, including this one, Ain't Misbehaving. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So in both those songs, you heard a little bit of this boogie music, which was a part of early jazz, even from like the 20s and 30s on. And boogie continued to be an occasional part of what became big band music, which the era big band was like 30s, 40s, the biggest era. And then went on really to become the basis of rock and roll piano. So like boogies from back in the day might be. There's all kind. There's a bunch of variations. So like there was a popular song in the 60s called Baby Elephant Walk that used that. For example, early rock and roll, you had the like that, Jerry Lee Lewis. So I'm going to play you one of a number of songs that from that era that had a sort of underlying boogie. When I'm that era, I'm talking about 30s, 40s. Night Train is a really famous one. This was a good example of big band music from the 30s, 40s. This was the Glenn Miller Orchestra and one of their bigger hits. There are a lot of famous train songs back in the day. Something about the vibe of trains really fit blues and jazz, like Night Train. And this one, Take the A Train, and this one, Chattanooga Choo Choo. Thank you. Thank you very much. So big bands flourished in the 40s, but they're also challenged by World War II because they require a lot of personnel, and a lot of folks were sent off to war and needed to be. So by the end of the 40s, there was a little more trend toward smaller groups. And in those small groups, there was a little more experimentation, including with a form of jazz that had started to happen in the early 40s called bebop. And bebop was very interesting because it was created by some of the top musicians at the time, like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, who I think were getting a little bored with playing their parts within a big band and wanted to try something fresh and show what they can do, because they had, training that in skill equal to classical musicians. So musicians like them began to experiment with melodies that were not as easy to follow. So one of the great hits of, I think for a while, the most recorded song of all time was Stardust. The melody moves around, but you can follow it. Bebop took melodies that were known and extended them and made it much more challenging to the ear to follow. So, for example, a big hit of the 30s and 40s was "How High the Moon," and you've probably all heard it. So a basic melody is like. So Charlie Parker took that and extended the melody so that it became something called ornithology, which was a joke because he was called Bird. And there were a lot of in-jokes between musicians in those days. So. So right away, it's got a whole different feeling, right? It's more of a cerebral or mental exercise to follow the. That doesn't mean it's worse, but it doesn't grab you quite as easily as, say, "How High the Moon." It's easy to follow that versus. So bebop became the form of music that really the best musicians of the time were interested in. And people created all sorts of interesting melodies and different ideas and different ways of playing jazz to accommodate the style. But what happened along the way was, whereas swing music was able to get a dance audience and a listening audience on the radio, there was no way music like that was going to be popular music or stay popular music. It was too cerebral, too angular, too hard to follow. There weren't words to it almost ever. Later people have added words to bebop songs, but mostly they're instrumental. So they're virtually never sung. It takes a real virtuoso to sing bebop accurately and improvise on it. You can't dance to it. So all the hallmarks of popular music kind of disappeared with bebop. So jazz as a whole started to become less popular as bebop ascended throughout the 40s and into the 50s. In fact, that opened the door for something else to become popular, namely rock and roll, which started out as a form called rhythm and blues, and in the mid '50s just exploded with the young generation of that time. Not that any of you were around then, but um, it the, and I really think that a lot of what made that possible was that jazz became more of a cerebral music for intelligent people. Not entirely, not entirely. There were still a lot of popular jazz songs. You had Frank Sinatra, Ella. You had people who could draw big audiences, but songs like that Ornithology weren't going to be top 40 hits. So not all of what's called bebop are really hard to follow melodies. I'm going to play one of my favorites. It's called Lady Bird. Thank you. Thank you so much. Lady Bird is by Todd Dameron, a really great jazz composer. So when there are trends in any of the arts, always elicit counter trends. So while jazz was becoming a little more cerebral, angular, and technical, there started to be a movement. There were actually many. There's cool jazz was another thing that started to happen. But something called hard bop developed, which was an attempt to take bebop style melodies but ground them a little more in blues and gospel, which made them much more relatable and recognizable for the average listener, and I think more fun. Hard bop's probably my favorite form of jazz. So, like the most famous hard bop song might be "Moanin'," which is. Do people recognize that one? I'm going to play you one that is a bit similar, and you probably will recognize too. It's called the Work Song. So as we're moving here into the 50s, which is when that kind of music developed, a whole lot of experimentation started to happen. Miles Davis started to make his epic recordings, so did John Coltrane, and they developed huge followings and had very impactful music stylistically and just in terms of tunes. You also had a lot of stylists and folks trying different things. So one of them was the Dave Brubeck Group, which put out a whole album of songs in unusual time signatures, which instead of 4 beats or 3 beats, like 5 beats to a measure or 7, which to our ear would sound really unusual. And that was the basis for Take 5. That's why it's called Take 5, which means take a break, but it's also in 5-beat time. And Take 5, I think possibly is the most played, like in terms of radio play, streaming, etc., jazz song of all time, I think. And you'll recognize it. So I'm going to do my arrangement of it. Thank you very much. So this idea actually that came from a classical, like a modern classical piece. That is a thing about jazz is if you're a jazz musician, you might come up with arrangements like that's an arrangement of that piece, but you're always looking to add new elements or try something different. So that's part of what keeps jazz being interesting, even though a lot of the songs, when you do get to hear jazz, that you hear were written a long time ago. There still is that element of creativity, especially with a small group, where sometimes if you're part of that, you don't know where it's going to go next, except roughly within the form. But who's going to play when and how you go about it. You create on the fly. So as jazz moved through the later 50s, 60s, 70s, there began to be something called free jazz, where people just simply did free improvising, either in relation to something present, or it could be a work of art or poem or person or nothing, just whatever was on their mind at the moment. You also had something called modal playing, which that piece used a little of, where you're staying on the same chords. You could kind of hear that stays there, and you did. There's all kind of scales or patterns of types of notes you can play to work with that repeated chords, to make it interesting. And John Coltrane very famously did that with his version of My Favorite Things, which some people mark as the real beginning of modern jazz. There also started to be more of a sense for some musicians of a philosophical or spiritual quest involved with jazz. And there are musicians like Sun Ra and Coltrane that very much led with that in their thinking. And there developed some pieces that I call introspective jazz, that are meant to take you on a more of an inner journey to wherever that ends up being. We've had ballads always in jazz and popular music, and they can do that. They tend to be aimed pretty strictly toward feelings, and what I'm calling interior jazz involves feelings, but is more. So Wayne Shorter, Miles Davis, Bill Evans, Chick Corea all wrote some songs of that type that are meant to take you on a bit of a journey. And I'm going to do one I wrote that influenced by all those people, and I call it Indigo Night. This is a very good one to close your eyes if you like. When you listen to music and close your eyes, so much of the brain is involved with visual processing. We just know that anatomically, that a lot of energy is freed up to fully take in sound. And sometimes when people listen with their headphones, they close their eyes, right? Because you just get. So if you wish, you can do that. This is called Indigo Night. Anybody tried the experiment of closing your eyes? Yeah? Was it nice, right? Try that with some music you love. It's just great. Once you do it, it's like, wow, I should do this all the time. So, where has jazz been? Well, where was it? Just 50s and 60s. Where has jazz gone since then? By the way, what time is it? Oh, okay. Okay, so we got to end in a second. All right. So like I said, this is just a little journey through a few stops in jazz, the history of jazz music, because it's such a broad subject. I'm just picking out a few things. I would have loved to play some bossa nova and other things for you. Um, so to pick up where we're just talking in a very, very general way about how jazz has changed and progressed. Um, in the 60s, you started to see, besides some of these other, the modal playing and other things we're talking about, experiments in other time sections like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Um, uh, Combining of jazz with what had now become the new popular music, rock and roll. And anybody remember the group Blood, Sweat, and Tears? Yeah, and Spinning Wheel and songs like that. That was considered like a very fresh thing when it came out. Chicago, Steely Dan were other groups that really employed a jazz sound and combined it, with popular music and just created. Oh, sorry, just created great music. Um, there was also the combining of jazz with funk, which Herbie Hancock, the Headhunters very famously did, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Chick Corea, and Return to Forever. And those were huge things in the 60s and 70s. There was a time that Chick Corea's group in the 70s could get 40,000 people to a live concert, which had become sort of unheard of since jazz was no longer really the main popular music, or Chameleon by Herbie Hancock. Um, um, Jazz has really, to me, for a long time been involved with fusion or mixing with other seemingly different genres. John Coltrane, very famously brought some ideas of Indian ragas or Indian scales to his playing, and also what's is called microtonal playing, where you're playing in between intervals. Um, there are a lot of folks that have combined jazz with different uh, folk forms. Um, and I'm going to end today with a version of my favorite things, which, again, is sometimes seen as a landmark, John Coltrane's version of that, beginning of modern jazz. And my version, has bits of what used to be called New Age or Windham Hill music, folk, classical, other stuff. And to me, for a long time, that's very much been the direction of jazz in terms of creativity and new, is just continuing to bring jazz into combination and connection with other music in the world. So you'll recognize this in a second.